Aloha. In this video, I want to go through the design or the top level structural conventions for BowFolios. So I'll start by kind of going through this part of the documentation. This is the basic layout of the system. It's in the app directory. So if you go here, there's BowFolios, and then there's the app directory, and then there's the config directory. Basically, we have configuration settings outside the app directory because they need to be kept separate. But inside the app directory, we have this basic structure here. We're going to have a top-level client directory and imports, a node modules, a private, a public, and a server. So the way Meteor works, just to remind you, is that everything in the client directory is going to be loaded on the client side. Everything on the server in the server directory is going to be loaded on the server side. And then you have stuff that's publicly available by the server in the running server in this public directory. You have stuff that you can access privately within the server that's not made available. Node modules is a special directory that's stores your NPM packages and so forth, so you don't worry about that. And then we have this special imports directory, and the idea there is that in the imports directory, unless you explicitly import something, Meteor won't know about it. And so as a result, what happens is this main.js in the client side and this main.js file on the server side are quite important, because those files, we know that file is going to be loaded by the client because it's in the client directory, or loaded into the client because it's in the client directory, and then this guy has all the import statements to pick out from this imports directory the stuff that it needs. Similarly, the main.js on the server side has a bunch of import statements to pick out of this imports directory what it needs. Let's just take a look at that. So if we go to the client and we go main.js, you can see, okay, here's all these imports for this stuff, and then things will be loaded in the order that they appear in this file. And in old versions of Meteor, there was not this imports directory and not this ability for the person to control the load ordering in a nice way. So it seems like kind of a pain, and you may ask yourself why we have to do it. Actually, there's really good reasons for doing it this way. That people learn through bitter experience. So similarly, if we go to the server side, you can see the main.js, and in fact that's a lot shorter, because on the server side, unlike the client side, we don't have all of this stuff from the UI directory, right? That's all user interface stuff. Only the client side cares about that. Okay, so that's that. Let me dig down a little deeper now into the imports directory. So the imports directory has basically three pieces. Okay, API, startup, and UI. API is what the Meteor people recommend calling this part of the system. I think of it more like the data model, and I'm going to refer to the data model a lot when I talk about this system, because it's the data model. It's the stuff that both the client and the server need to access. Okay, so in BowFolios we have this concept of interest, and we have this concept of a profile. The profile being the professional portfolio data, or the data that's used to generate the professional portfolio for a given user. And interest is a generic term that can be associated with multiple users. We use that for filtering and so forth. Now we also, excuse me, if we go look at these, okay, we can see that, for example, the data model for profile is actually implemented as a JavaScript class. So it's called a class profile collection. It actually extends a base collection, which is this guy right here, and this base collection class implements common kinds of operations that any MongoDB collection would want you'd want to do. Okay, so for example, finding out the number of items in the collection is a very common operation. And so the way we implement the data model here, which is different from what you'll have seen so far in your Meteor example systems is to use JavaScript classes. And this is turns out I've used this for a few systems now. I really like this technique. What we're going to do is we're going to create a class, and then we're going to create exactly a single instance of this class. We're going to bind it to a constant called, in this case, profiles, which is the collection, and it represents the collection of all profiles defined in the system. Okay? And so we construct this single instance, and when we construct the instance, we give it a name. We also give it a schema, simple schema, that specifies the structure. And then we, by convention, we create a method called define, and the define method is going to take an object that represents the required and optional fields to create a document of this particular type. Okay. We also provide a mechanism, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that enables us to dump out a JSON object or a JavaScript object, but it's going to be a JSON object, that has within it all the fields and in a format acceptable to define. So what you can kind of see here is foreshadowing, is that we create a define method which creates documents. We create a dump object which can take a document in Mongo and then output an object that's acceptable to define. If we were to simply save these objects in a file, we'd have a way to dump and restore our database, and that's what we're doing with this. So we have a profile collection, we have an interest collection. The interest collection is a very simple collection that just has a name and a description that defines interests. Okay, and then as I said before, we have this base collection which provide a variety of operations common to any kind of collection that we're implementing. So that's the API or data model section of the imports directory. Then we have a startup, and that provides the files that we want to run. It's by convention kind of the files that run when the system starts up. Router.js contains the configuration for flow router that specifies the landing page, the directory page, and the two user pages, which is the kind of the profile page and the filter page. And we have a user account, which is going to, when we log into the system, redirect us to the profile page. And then on the server side, we have a validate new user callback, which runs when we have a new user, or whenever a user is validated, and it's logged into the system and it's a valid user. Then we run this method, which basically checks to see if we have a profile for that user, and if we don't, let's go ahead and define one right away, so that when we go to that profile page, we have a document that we can fill out. The initialized database.js file enables us to load data into the system. I'll get to that a little bit later. Publications this is a file that's loaded that just publishes all of the interests and collections to the client, so that the clients can see all profiles and all interests. Okay, so now we, in the user interface side, we're going to adopt the Meteor convention that the router, if we go to the router is always going to render it's going to call render with two things. One is a template that is the layout of the page. That means kind of basically like the menu and the footer and whatever. And then the main part is going to be an actual page, okay, which is going to be one of these guys here, like directory page, or like filter page, or like landing page, and then the associated layouts, directory layout, landing layout, user layout, okay? And then we may have little individual kind of widgets within a given page, and maybe even shared between pages, and those, according to the Meteor kind of conventions, are called components. So in the UI components directory, you can see we have a directory profile component, which is this profile object that shows up in the directory page. We have form controls, which show up on both the filter page and the profile page, which we take from Meteor Application Forum. The landing page has some components as well. The user page has a form field in there. So that's the basic way that the user interface is structured. We have layouts, that's the overall template. We have a single page that goes within each layout, and then pages can have within them these little reusable components which can occur on multiple pages. And the router kind of observes that convention in that it always is going to redirect. The action is always going to be to render a specific layout with a specific page. Okay, that I think is a quick overview of basically the entire system. I didn't talk about the private part, the private database part. I'll get to that in another screencast. I want to finish up though by saying that we have these conventions for how we do importing, which is specific to BowFolios and what I want you to follow in this class, which is that, as I said before, client/main.js and server/main.js are going to kick off the imports. And what they will do is they will import a bunch of directories, with the exclusion of this one CSS file, which isn't a directory, but all the rest of these things are directories. And if you look at the code, you can see in the imports directory, every single subdirectory or leaf directory always has an index.js. Okay? And that index.js is always responsible for loading the source files associated with it. Now, the test files are not loaded by this import statement because they're found by the test runner. So these are excluded. But if you look here in this index.js, we can see it loads these two files. If we go to, I don't know, that's the directory file. It has an index.js, it loads that file. Form controls, this is a better one. A whole bunch of files. The index.js is responsible for loading all of them. Okay, so it's basically a two-level approach to doing imports. You have this top level where client/main.js and server/main.js import directories, all of the directories that they need, and then within a given directory you have another index.js which makes sure that it is loading or importing all the files in its own directory. Okay, so there's only two places. If you're trying to figure out why something isn't imported and should be, then there's only two places to look. Either you forgot to import it at this top level, or you added a file in a directory and forgot to update the index.js. That's the strategy. It works pretty good. You'll see some other systems where every single level of the directory hierarchy has an index.js, and it gets very transitory and kind of hard to even understand what's being loaded and when. This approach makes it much simpler to understand what's loaded and when. It has some drawbacks, but it tends to work pretty good. Finally, we have naming convention. Files and directories are all lowercase. The words are separated by hyphens. For example, accounts-config.js. Global JavaScript variables are capitalized, such as profiles. Other variables are camel case. And then template are named as strings, and they're going to be capitalized with an underscore. This is just following the Meteor kind of thing. And they are held in a directory that has the same name, except now we're using the file naming convention. So the template directory page capitalized with an underscore becomes a lowercase directory dash page. And that's just the way it is. Okay, we talked about the two profile collections, and I'll get to the tests and so forth in a subsequent screencast.